Hello, and welcome to Text Appeal. I am your host, Travis Villalpando. It is with excitement that I present the first episode of a new series I will be developing during the spring semester of 2025. I was fortunate enough to be offered the opportunity to participate in an independent study in place of a regular curriculum required course here at Adams State University. Dr. Chris Kam, Assistant Professor of Psychology, will act as my mentor over the next several months as I assist him in research regarding the topic of political polarization. Dr. Kam has already published articles on this topic, and this independent study has the potential to bring forth an original manuscript co-written by him and I, where we are striving toward further publication. Dr. Kam has set out to address the very relevant problem of political polarization in our culture. So naturally, the research we will be doing revolves around countering such polarization. The nature of this research will unfold episode by episode. However, keep in mind that I'm going to be narrating the notes that I take while conducting a literature review. Today, I am simply going to provide some definitions in addition to introducing some key concepts relevant to the literature on political polarization. A main objective of today's episode is to flesh out the meaning of a term called cognitive complexity. So let's just jump right in defining cognitive complexity. According to Granello 2010, cognitive complexity is, quote, the ability to absorb, integrate, and make use of multiple perspectives, unquote. A cognitively complex argument or position in politics is going to be able to account for not only the existence of other positions, but also an acknowledgement of possible validity to other positions as well. This does not imply that two positions which are diametrically opposed, which means as opposite as they can somehow be wholly accurate simultaneously, but instead that different component pieces of separate arguments can have validity at the same time. Take the relevant and ongoing debate between the pro-choice and pro-life positions on abortion. For the sake of illustration, I'm going to represent the extreme positions that exist on the outermost portion of the political spectrum or pole on this argument. The pro-choice extreme might look like, quote, there are no situations in which an abortion is morally questionable, and abortion should be legal in all contexts, unquote. On the other end of the political pole, the pro-life extreme might sound like, quote, there are no situations in which abortion is morally acceptable and abortion should be illegal in all contexts, unquote. Please remember that these extremes are purposely designed to be simplistic and inflexible. Now, these positions are problematic for many reasons, but the absolutism present in the arguments are what I want to focus in on. Notice how there is very little gray area when analyzing these positions. They are in stark contrast with one another in a binary fashion, where abortion is either always morally acceptable or is always morally wrong. At this point, I want you to try and think of at least one situation where abortion is at the very least controversial or up for debate. For example, what about the situation in which the mother, in the context of pregnancy, is in a life-threatening situation where abortion is the only means to save her life? If you are at this point realizing that your position accounts for at least some exceptions to the rule, then your position is already at least somewhat more cognitively complex than that of the extremes I put forth. It is also important to note the basic definition of a complex argument at this time. I came up with this definition based on, looking at the definition of the word complex. And then if we think about what an argument is, I think that a complex argument is going to be able to differentiate or have different elements across different dimensions, yet still manages to be logically consistent and in the best cases, functional in practice, right? Okay, so now you should be able to see a little bit more clearly what cognitive complexity is, and this is going to be a key term throughout the whole literature review process that I'm going through, right? Because I'm trying to figure out how to counter political polarization, and I'm kind of backpacking off of the research that Dr. Kam has already done in the article that he published is the one I'm actually reviewing right now. So, episode by episode is going to be notes on various articles, and this episode is focused on an article published by Dr. Cam himself. Okay, moving along with some definitions, I now want to define cognition, right? Because that's the word in cognitive complexity. We should probably know what cognition is as well, right? Cognition is defined as a mental action or process of acquiring knowledge. The cognitive domain of psychology focuses on mental processes such as perception, memory, intelligence, and thinking in general. Using this definition, we can now have a more clear understanding of cognitive complexity in the context of political differences, right? Now, another term, I'm going to just kind of brush past a couple terms here, is interpersonal complexity. This term is also relative for the purpose of this research, as this concept focuses on the relationship between cognitive complexity and interpersonal relationships, meaning person to person, right? Interpersonally complex individuals see the world as a complex and dynamic arena for action, rather than seeing it as a simple and static realm. Lower levels of interpersonal complexity also correlate with a tendency to resort to more warlike and destructive forms of conflict resolution, right? So keep that in mind. Lower levels of interpersonal complexity lead to more warlike and destructive forms of conflict resolution. Now, another term that I'm just going to define here, although this one's a little bit more self evident, is political polarization. This is a term or concept that refers to difference in political opinions between groups and individuals. I'm actually going to provide a technical definition that is given to us by Bellehumeur 2023. It is cited within this article that I'm reviewing. The technical definition goes, quote, growing ideological and policy-based differences between political groups and the affective distance between them. Keyword affective. We're going to get to that. Now, a very easy concept is to take the ideas of the far left and the far right sides on the political spectrum. I'm sure you're more or less familiar with what people mean by that. It's more complex than it looks on the outside, right? And that's what we're trying to dig into here, is that things are more complex than they seem at a superficial level. But if we take this kind of really holistic view of the political spectrum, we can see that there's a left side of politics and a right side of politics, and there that makes up the political spectrum, right? Where you fall on that spectrum. And political polarization is that is this idea that our society is becoming more polarized, where there's less people in the middle, there's less people distributed across the whole political spectrum, and instead people are clumping up at the ends, right, on the poles, on the places that are oftentimes in great conflict with one another in terms of political difference and political opinions. Now, the whole point of this literature review is to understand the nature of political polarization using research, right? And not just using our intuition, which is something that I'm going to be touching on here in a moment. So, the next term that I want to define or go a little deeper on was mentioned in that last definition when I said, uh, political polarization has to do with the affective distance between groups, between in groups and out groups. Your in group being the group you identify with, the out group being the other. So, affect polarization is a subcategory that falls under political polarization that more specifically describes this emotional gap between a person's in group and out group, kind of as I just said. That is given to us by Lienger et al. 2016. Affect, of course, referring to emotion in this case, not to be confused with affect, such as cause and effect, right? Affect, AFFECT. Affect polarization takes place when, for instance, members of a political group automatically treat and think of their in group with positive emotions while treating and perceiving other political groups with negative feelings, right? Before they even know the person, before they even understand the person's argument, it's complete ad hominem, right? It's attack of the person's character based on their political identification, right? So somebody on the right looks at somebody on the left and they say, "You're a bad person," right? There's an emotional gap between them because you're on the left, and vice versa. You're on the left, you see somebody who's conservative, right? And you say, "This person is morally, their moral character is in question because of their political identification before you know anything else about them." That is what we mean by affect polarization between in-groups and out-groups. Now, this is not a surprise. However, at its extreme, affect polarization can become violent, and members between groups become less compassionate and empathetic of the other, to the point of social pathology. I mean, just think of war, right? Which is the most extreme case of affect polarization. It's where you actually arm your troops against another nation or against another tribe, different historical contexts, where the affect polarization is so bad and you're so driven toward war that you're willing to take up arms against your enemy and you see them as a threat to your society. Now, of course, there are instances where we can look back at history and say, we can judge in hindsight and say who was morally correct here and there, depending on which war or conflict you're looking at. But the point is that affect polarization drives us toward war, and war should not be our first option, right? It's a bit of a last resort. It's something that should be carefully considered, right? War is not something to laugh at. That's one way to put it. Okay, so now with some definitions out of the way, and those are going to be really foundational to the whole literature review, I now want to touch on some of the consequences of overly simple political explanations that lack cognitive complexity. So, once again, to do a little bit of review, cognition is this idea of our mental processes, right? The action of acquiring knowledge, cognition, thinking, and complexity, of course, meaning something complex is differentiated but still functional, right? It has different pieces, different dynamic moving parts, but it still keeps a certain level of coherence. So cognitive complexity is kind of the opposite of simple. Simple, we would say something that's cognitively simple is, of course, the opposite of something that's cognitively complex. So now here are some of the consequences of overly simple political explanations and opinions. One such consequence associated with affect polarization in particular is the tendency to demonize the other or the outgroup. An example of this in recent times is demonstrated in a 2016 study by Doherty et al. Affect polarization in recent times has led to political animosity between groups. For the first time since a 1992 survey, both Democrats, 55% that were reported, I believe, and Republicans, 58%, had very, quote, unfavorable views of the outgroup, unquote. This is coming from Doherty et al., 2016, as I said. Now, think about in your own life, right? When you open up a social media app, when you open up Twitter or X, formerly Twitter, or maybe Threads by Meta, the conversations that take place on those apps are quite frightening in terms of just how demonizing people are, right? It's just completely, you are a terrible reason because of XYZ, and there's no gray area, and you have no point, you have no moral character if you follow this particular political view, and it's like this conflation, and they associate one thing with another, right? If you're on the left, you're a radical woke um socialist, communist, you're going to bring the next wave of communism that's going to, bring about the, the terrible things that happened in the Soviet Union, right? Something like that. And then on the opposite side, if you're a conservative, oh, you're a Nazi, right? That's something that gets thrown around, right? You're either a communist or a Nazi these days. That's what the internet says. So I don't recommend getting your political opinions on X or Threads. That's not a very good method of understanding what's really going on. Those platforms actually accelerate political polarization in a lot of ways, right? And I'm sure I'm going to come across some research that points to that. Now, I can't say it with 100% confidence, right? Because this particular article doesn't really talk about social media, but I have a pretty strong gut feeling, and we'll see if my gut feeling ends up being right. Another consequence of simple politics, so to speak, is that political tensions rise. Like I said earlier, simplicity um, drives us towards war. And this is because simplicity in rhetoric leads to conflict. It's a driving factor of conflict. And we have seen this in the recent 2016 and 2020 Trump Biden elections. Remember that interpersonal complexity is a favorable trait when it comes to the competency of an individual, and specifically in terms of how successful somebody is in their political endeavors. However, politicians are likely to be aware that simple forms of rhetoric are more useful in a political race, and they certainly take advantage of this. Consider the following quote, there has been a trend in recent years for both Democrat and Republican politicians to be more simple in their rhetoric, with both Biden and Trump having lower integrative complexity. Integrative complexity uh, is synonymous to interpersonal complexity, which is something I already went over. Okay, so Biden and Trump have lower integrative complexity compared to the average US president. That's coming from Conway and Zubrod 2022. This simplicity of rhetoric might have its benefits in terms of gaining favor in the eyes of voters, right? People like a simple, short, rhetorical message such as "Make America Great Again," or when we see that the left side of the aisle, they take up certain political issues and they really exemplify, like, this is what our politics are about, right? Um, and they come up with these little slogans and things like that, right? That's what it's referring to, a more simple rhetoric. It's less complex. There's not as many elements to their argumentation. It's a more simple form of rhetoric, and voters like that. As voters, it's much more convenient to be simple in your politics, right? And this is what I'm kind of getting at here. Now, I have another example here where simplicity is predictive of escalation between groups, while cognitive complexity is predictive of peaceful relations. For example, in the lead up to the American Civil War, subgroups within the Democratic and Republican parties, which were surely looked different than they do today, but still the leading parties at the time, were higher in integrative complexity. Let me rephrase that. Democrats and Republicans that were higher in integrative complexity were generally more war avoidant compared to their counterparts on each side who were lower in integrative complexity. Those lower in integrative complexity were more likely to drive the nation toward war. This is coming from Tetlock et al., 1994. Peace is often more difficult than war. It is much more convenient to demonize the outgroup than it is to consider the outgroup's opinion in great detail, and to train oneself to become more neutral in considering political differences. You see, we human beings are inherently affective and emotional beings, and we are also extremely susceptible to confirmation bias from a cognitive point of view. Peace requires the balance of competing views, goals, resources, and values, and solutions to major issues are rarely self evident. It's much easier to see people with politics that differ from your own as morally malicious or simply incompetent than it is to gain an accurate understanding of opposing views, right? That's kind of the whole point here. We want people to be cognitively complex, and because complexity is predictive of peace, while simplicity is predictive of war. It's human nature. This is political science we're talking about. These are important things. You might want to consider why, depending on, your framework for what the world is and what the world is made of and how the world got here, whether you're religious, whether you're atheist, whether you're on the left, on the right. You might want to consider such things, right? Because regardless of what you think, the research does show that simplicity is predictive of war. So we're trying, as one kind of angle to look at how to counter political polarization, is through cognitive complexity and interpersonal complexity that's already been established. And that's kind of what I'm going over in this literature review. Now, I want to finish off this episode with a bit of a hard pill to swallow because I think it is important to start recognizing how we as individuals contribute to political polarization by adopting such demonization of the outgroup and rallying behind simple rhetoric, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, left, right, up, down, right? If you're demonizing the outgroup totally, you're not seeing them as human even, you're seeing them as a demon, as something that's right, that we should rid the world of, maybe something like that. That's very strong language, of course, but people have views like that on both sides of the aisle. And if you're really rallying behind a simple rhetoric, kind of in a way where you're idolizing politicians and a simple rhetoric, well, it's kind of dangerous because you see, if one's political opinions lack variance in perspective and they lack introspective explanations and they lack hospitality of the outgroup, said individual is likely accelerating polarization. At this time, I want any listeners to ask yourself if you consider yourself to be cognitively complex, right? And in addition to general cognitive complexity as a whole, consider your level of interpersonal or integrative complexity and think of examples where you exhibit behaviors that display these qualities. If you are someone who frequently becomes emotional when someone with a differing political view offers up their political opinion, you have likely internalized cognitive and emotional biases toward both your in group and your out group. Of course, certain forms of political extremism are going to rub you the wrong way, but generally speaking, cognitive complexity involves a deep dive into many points of view, which is not always easy, yet can lead to more complex and compassionate political opinions. Now, of course, if you're like, hey, Travis, but what if somebody is actually propagating pretty self evidently something like Nazism, right? Like, of course, that that is something that we need to combat in its own right, right? We understand that. Now it's complex though, because we don't want to conflate just because you're a conservative does not make you a Nazi. That's what we're trying to get at here. And just because you're on the left does not make you a Soviet Union-esque Stalin communist, right? Uh, Points on all sides have their virtue and their sin. That's what we want to understand. If we go back to the beginning when I talked about how two very different political opinions can both have validity in their component parts at the same time, right? You have kind of a thesis, right? You have kind of an idea you put forth, and then somebody is contra to that idea. That would be the antithesis. And then there's usually something that's more complex, a more complex system of thinking, which we could think of as a synthesis: thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, of course, we keep doing that as much as we possibly can until we can get as a coherent and complex argument as we possibly can. And it's difficult. It is difficult. That's the hard pill to swallow here. The hard pills to swallow. One is, if your political opinions lack in cognitive complexity and interpersonal complexity, and you're very much a hateful person toward your outgroup, well, you're accelerating polarization. And I urge you to take a look in the mirror, so to speak, right? And the other hard pill to swallow is that it's not easy. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes research, it takes, true something like the internalization of a Socratic dialogue with oneself. That's kind of a practical approach to identifying your own bias and beginning this process of countering political polarization in your own life. I mean, at this time, I would even like for you to play devil's advocate against your own position. It should be your aim to seek evidence that contradicts your own intuitive opinions and watch as your own political framing grows in complexity. Remember, complexity in opinion, rhetoric, and negotiation are indicative of peace, while simplicity in opinion, rhetoric, and a lack of compromise drive us toward war at different scales, right? War is a tricky word. We don't full blown, full scale nation international war is different than, for example, a small war inside the home between mom and dad arguing over political difference, right? But conflict is a better word, right? Simplicity drives us toward conflict at different scales, all the way from the trivial up to the catastrophic. Okay, now, next episode, I will be continuing with this topic. I went over a whole bunch there. Uh, that was great. This is really good for me to review this literature and to process it verbally and to really make it stick in my mind as I set out to write an original manuscript on this topic. So, next time, I'll talk about how oftentimes political differences are actually not as different as they appear between rival groups, yet affect polarization leads groups to misperceive the outgroups of political opinion, right? So we misperceive even what we're disagreeing about. We don't even know what we're disagreeing about half the time. We don't know where we agree and where we disagree. We just demonize the outgroup. That's kind of it's a human tendency, really. And the research shows that. And I'm going to be talking about a particular study done on that topic next time. So thank you for tuning in to this quite academic and more rigorous form of podcast. I hope we are all a little bit more cognitively complex after that, and may you have a good rest of your day.